Okay, so this is some experimental evidence on financial education in a small neighboring country of yours, Brazil. This is financial education in high schools, and this is with a large study that was conducted in collaboration with many government, non-government actors, including the Ministry of Education and the banking sector in Brazil and the World Bank. And the few names that you see on there are some of the co-authors from the World Bank, but in truth, the credit goes to a lot more people in Brazil. Okay, so just as way of introduction, and I'll go a little bit faster. So financial education has grown to be an important policy tool, especially in the wake of the recent financial crisis, where many individuals and households were sort of shown to be making very inefficient and sort of incorrect financial decisions over indebtedness, for example, not saving enough. And if we pick up any sort of household survey on financial access, we will see that any indicator of financial education or financial knowledge is strongly correlated with better financial outcomes. So if you are more financially educated, then you save more, you you repay your loans on time, et cetera, et cetera. Any indicator you see, there's this strong correlation between financial education and financial outcomes. So that led to policymakers and donors to invest heavily in financial education programs around the world. However, the evidence on the effectiveness lags significantly behind sort of the rhetoric. So some of the papers that are out there, and many are in the pipeline, have shown that it's really not a silver bullet. It's not that it's suddenly going to make people improve behavior substantially. There are some effects, but they're not massive. One thing that does come out from some of the literature that is out there is that targeting tends to work. So if you focus financial education on particular groups where potentially the marginal returns or the potential returns are highest, then you'll get more bang for your buck. So with that sort of in mind, we sort of focused this study on high school students. And if you think about it for a minute, this is kind of a very interesting audience because it's a captive audience, right? So they have to come to school. So it's not like you pick up any paper on evaluation, the first thing you see is that the take-up rate is very low, right? So here, they're coming to school anyway and attendance is mandatory in a sense, so you're just adding on another sort of thing that they have to study, so hence take-up is very, very high. The second thing is that this age group is primed to learn. So you and I are sort of old people. We've gone to school. Well, many of you are still going to school because we're in a school, but where we have our rigid, sticky preferences, which are difficult to change. But these are young high school kids. They are primed to learn. They listen to their teachers, or at least some of them do, and they absorb the information and can potentially use it for the future. And the third most important point is that this is the youth. So any sort of improvements that we can enact in their behavior and their knowledge will have a multiplier effect in the future as they grow older. So all these sort of things sort of pointed us in the direction of trying to do a study on youth, financial education for youth. So what we did in Brazil is a pretty large financial education evaluation, and it was started primarily or motivated by a local demand from within Brazil to have something like this done. So just to give you a highlight why financial education in Brazil is important, so a survey, many surveys, but one that we sort of highlight here suggests that sort of the awareness of sort of financial concepts is very, very low. People make poor financial decisions, and even among people who have the money to potentially save, the saving rates are fairly low. So in response to this, the Brazilian government in 2010 launched a national strategy for financial education which is a priority initiative, and it involves key partnerships within, sort of between the central bank, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the pension providers, and the insurance provider, in addition to numerous private sector organizations as well. And the goals of this national strategy were to develop personal financial skills, stimulate savings, and broaden the use of financial products. So as part of this strategy, they were interested in evaluating a financial education program in high schools. And they call this the pilot program, and this is where sort of we fit in as the evaluators. The World Bank was invited to design a scientific study to evaluate a financial education program which they had developed. And this financial education program was very innovative and very comprehensive, and it was case studies based. And it's not like you go to math and you go to Portuguese and you go to English and then you go to financial education. It wasn't a separate class. It was actually just providing new textbooks for the existing courses where some of the examples that are typically used in instruction have been replaced with examples that are case study based on financial education. So, for example, one of the assignments that was part of the course is, well, go home and make a household budget with your parents. So that does two things. One, it starts ingrains the thought of financial education or thinking about budgeting within the student, but also, secondly, it sort of involves the household, the adults in the household, to participate with the students and potentially have some multiplier or sort of spillover effects, and we are able to measure this. Okay, so the impact evaluation objectives were to measure the impact of a 3-semester long program, and that's 1.5 years, that teaches high school students financial concepts. So if we think along sort of the causal chain or the chain of impact, one would expect the chain to go from you give somebody financial education, what happens? Well, firstly, their financial knowledge or awareness improves, so we want to measure that. Secondly, we want this financial knowledge to translate into behavior change, and that's sort of the second bullet point. And then on top of that, since these are high school kids, many of them don't have, haven't fully entered or integrated into the financial markets, we were interested in involving the parents as well. So we do that two ways. One way is indirectly through the example that I mentioned to you, for example, which is we have exercises that involve parental interaction, such as making a household budget. But also, in addition to that, we conducted a standard financial education workshop for parents, where parents themselves were invited to come in, and we showed them some DVDs on savings, insurance, credit, etc. And we are able to measure effects of both of these. So if we think about it in sort of a simple results framework, so we're providing an input, which is financial education. Our goal is to change understanding and knowledge of sort of intertemporal choices, consumption choices. Firstly, we want to change current behavior, which is sort of increase savings or improve planning and spending. And let me clarify a little bit about savings. Many of you will say, well, these are high school kids. Why do we care about savings? Well, many of these kids are also in the age bracket where they are buying iPods and laptop computers and shoes and necklaces and jewelry, et cetera, et cetera. In Brazil, and I suspect perhaps in Peru as well, you can buy things on installments. And many of these kids do that. And the implicit interest rate on those contracts is very, very high. So one concept that we wanted to convey to them was that, hey, if you really want to buy that iPod, why don't you save up and buy it on cost, on cash, rather than buying it on credit and paying this large interest rate. So when we talk about savings among this target group, we're not talking about savings so they can buy a house. It's small savings so you can sort of save for a small period of time, build up some sum of money, so you can then spend it on something that you really want to buy. And potentially you can sort of the idea is that in the future, when they're making similar decisions but much larger decisions about vehicles or car or houses, then they would at least have the same concept in mind. And the other way, sort of, we we're interested in looking at is their attitudes towards future behavior. And we did this by consulting sort of the literature on child psychology, and we developed 2 forward-looking indicators of financial behavior, and I will talk about them in some detail later on. And finally, we were interested in household outcomes, which is measuring the outcomes, the decisions that the parents make through A, the spillover effects of the student intervention, and B, the direct effect of the parent intervention. Okay, so I will go through these a little bit quicker and get to the results faster. But where do things usually break down in such programs? So the first is, well, we don't see much effect on knowledge in many studies. And how do we address this problem? Well, we sort of spent a lot of time, and when I say we, it's the larger we, because most of this chunk of the work was done by the Brazilians themselves, the Ministry of Education and some private sector partners, is the quality. So the quality of the material was very, very high. And it was rigorously tested. It was pilot tested with actual students, not the students that are part in our study, but other similar students, and then sort of it was edited and then retested, et cetera. In addition to that, you can provide the fanciest textbooks you can, but they might just sit in their plastic wrap in the principal's office and never get used. And there is evidence for this happening, but here this did not happen, partly because, or primarily because, we actually actively involved the teachers by providing them training, by providing them a web portal where they could sort of interact with each other and with some sort of head trainers who are centrally located, and then also giving them sort of offline tools such as DVDs and a teacher training book. And in addition, they were provided some incentives for participation, in which sort of if the participation rate in sort of the end-line surveys was above a certain threshold percentage, then their school's name was entered into a lottery to potentially win a laptop computer for the school. So in that sense, we provided the incentives and made the program very attractive, and that made education sort of fun, and the take-up was fairly high. The second place where this breaks down is sort of behavior and attitudes. So here, sort of instead of sort of boring classroom instruction, okay, this is 5 times 7, and this is what you get. That's extremely boring. This was very practical. So this was, there were practical examples where, for example, there was a visit to the market, and then following the visit to the market, the students themselves were tasked with organizing their end-of-year class party. So they had to fundraise. They had to go out and buy all the food. They had to send out invitations, so whatever the printing costs, et cetera, and then they had to rent the appropriate place where the party was going to be held. And all this had to be planned before anything happened, and the students were involved in this. So this is something that they found a lot, really fun, because they could do it rather than just sort of trying to learn it by instruction. So learning by doing obviously has bigger sort of effect than just learning through instruction. And it was relevant to their lives, it was actionable information, and then there was this reinforcement mechanism by involving the parents as well. And lastly is household outcomes. Here, again, the interaction with the parents is critical. So just to give you some pictures, since pictures may wake up a few of you who are asleep. So here are some examples from the textbooks that were sent out. So keeping financial records, there are sort of very animated graphics here. We have instructions on tracking expenses, and then, sorry. Yeah, so then sort of how to make a sort of a calendar of expenses and tracking financial commitments. We provided sort of examples of role models of young people who were just out of high school and what kind of occupations they went into and what was required to get into those occupations. Making consumption choices, so you walk into a market and you're faced with all these flashy signs, and so how to navigate through all of that and find the real deal where it is, and ignore the ones that are trying to just rip you off. And in addition, so the modules were interspersed with these quizzes where you were asked certain questions, and then sort of the answers were provided by the instructor. This was the example I was giving. This is sort of planning for a party, so there's a very real interactive experience. In addition, buying responsibly, so here's how you would go about buying a computer. Do you really need it? And if you do, then there are several options. Maybe you should do your research before going and buying the flashiest one out there. So just to give you a preview, did it work? Yes, it did. Learning achievement that we find is 5 minutes. Okay, is greater than any other education program, and importantly, so the first bullet is that it's a quarter standard deviation improvement. That's just a way of normalizing this effect size so it's comparable to other studies. The important thing is that the distribution shifts. It's not just that the smartest kids got even smarter, it's that everybody got smarter. In terms of where smarter is financial education. So even the kids who scored really poorly at the beginning, they improved just as much as the kids who scored really well in the beginning. So it's not just, the program wasn't just targeted to one set of students with a certain background, it helped everybody, which is really nice. So let me run through very quickly, since I'm out of time almost, what the methodology is. So this is a very large-scale program. We had nearly 900 schools in 6 states of Brazil, and half of them were assigned to a treatment where they were given the financial education textbooks and the teacher training, and half of them weren't. And the half that weren't were promised the same program after the study period, and they're now getting it. In addition, half the parents were invited to this workshop for the parents. So this is sort of the distribution of districts. Clearly, Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro are the largest states in the country, so they get the larger number of schools. And in the end, we have about 20,000 students and parents, actually students, in our sample. So the sample size is very, very large. And the timeline essentially is that we have data from 3 surveys. We did a baseline survey in 2010 in August, then the program started immediately. We have a very short-term outcome survey after 1 semester, which was in November 2010, and then after 3 semesters, which was in November 2011. So we have both short-term and long-term results. And the important thing is that we can actually track these kids into the future, so we will have even longer-term outcomes for them as they progress through their lives. So thanks to randomization, our baseline outcomes are very balanced between treatment and control, and this is sort of the benefit of randomization. Let me show you results. So first, let's look at financial knowledge. So I've presented these as figures. So the first set of 2 bars is the follow-up 1 and follow-up 2. These are the 2 surveys. So the first one is the short term, and the second term is the long term. One thing I should say is that these are not the same set of students because there's turnover. So these are public schools, so kids come in and out quite often. So it's not that everybody who was in follow-up 1 is also in follow-up 2. There's quite a bit of turnover. So these figures are not entirely comparable for the same set of, this is not a panel. So the red line is the kids in the control schools, and the yellow or the green line is the kids in the treatment school. So you see, and all these differences are statistically significant at the 1% level. So these are very statistically significant effects. So in a financial proficiency test, the treated students scored significantly better than the control students, and by 7 to 5 percentage points. and this is equivalent to a quarter of standard deviation, which is a fairly significant effect. But importantly, what I wanted to show you is this distribution shift. So on the left-hand side, you see if we divide up the proficiency score by people who scored less than 50, somewhere in the middle, and who scored really well, you can see the difference between the treatment and the control, the treatment on the right and the control on the left, is that fewer students are scoring poorly. So the kids who score really poorly is going down from 30% to 22%, and the kids who are scoring really well is going up from 25% to 32%. So everybody is getting pushed to the right because of the treatment, which is great. It's not that the treatment is driven entirely by the highest scoring group. It's driven by everybody. And that's important for financial education, because we don't want to design financial education just for the best students. We want it to design it for everybody. And this is sort of the continuous version of that. Okay, I'm out of time. But I can run through some of these graphs. Everywhere we see effects that are fairly significant. It's spending behavior. We have a percentage of students who make a list of expenses, negotiate prices. We had these two indicators of future financial behavior, which are student financial autonomy, and here we find large effects. Intentions to save, which is, do you intend to save as you grow up? And we find large effects. And then spillover effects on parents are also significant. And I apologize, I have to run through these really fast. Last slide, this is sort of the important one. So why do we, let me just spend 30 seconds on this. Why do we do impact evaluation? I mean, of course, we, as academics, we're interested in a good journal publication, but how many people read journals? Very few. So the promise of impact evaluation is that we can sort of influence policy in the real world. And here's an example where, because of our study, the Ministry of Education in Brazil has now extended this program to 5,000 more public schools in the country and wants to do even more. They're developing a similar program for primary schools now, in addition to the high schools that we have, and there's talk about middle schools as well at some point in the future. So these are real measurable impacts of careful evaluation, which wouldn't have happened. The Minister of Education wouldn't have been interested if we hadn't presented these results to him in a very systematic way. And I'll stop there. Thank you.